My neighbor Kimberly Ashcroft rang my doorbell at 8:47 in the morning on a Tuesday in late September, holding a yellow HOA violation notice in her manicured hand, and she smiled at me the way a woman smiles when she has spent 4 months building a case against another woman she has never actually spoken to. She said, "Margaret, honey, I hate to be the one to deliver this, but the HOA board voted last night. That thing in your driveway, it has to go. You have 30 days, or we start fining you $300 a week." She held out the notice. Behind her, in my driveway, sat a 1987 military green M998 Humvee that my late husband Robert had been restoring for 11 years before he died. I was 63 years old. I was standing in my doorway in a bathrobe, holding a cup of coffee. My husband had been dead for 4 months. I took the notice from Kimberly's hand. I read the first line. Then I looked up at Kimberly Ashcroft, HOA board vice president, wife of a retired dentist, president of the neighborhood garden club, and I said 7 words that she would replay in her mind for the rest of her life. I said, "Kimberly, that vehicle is federal property." The husband, "My name is Margaret Whitfield. I am 63 years old. I live in a 4-bedroom colonial in a gated community called Wexford Estates in Fairfax County, Virginia, about 20 minutes from the Pentagon. I have lived in that house for 22 years. My late husband Robert and I bought it in 2003, when Robert was a senior mechanical engineer at the Naval Surface Warfare Center in Dahlgren. Robert died on the 12th of May of this year. He was 67. He had a heart attack in our garage on a Sunday afternoon, while working on the exact vehicle that Kimberly Ashcroft was now demanding I remove from my driveway. I need to tell you about Robert, because you cannot understand this story without understanding my husband. Robert Whitfield spent 38 years working for the United States Department of Defense as a civilian mechanical engineer. He was not military, he never wore a uniform, but he worked on some of the most important vehicle programs in the American defense industry from 1985 to 2023. He worked on early prototypes of the up-armored Humvee during the Gulf War. He worked on the mine-resistant ambush protected program after 2004. He was on the small technical team that helped diagnose the initial armor failures on the MATV program in 2010. He retired in 2023, at the age of 65, as one of the most respected senior civilian engineers in his division. He did not want to retire. He retired because I asked him to. I told him, over dinner in the fall of 2022, that I wanted to have my husband for a few years while we were both still healthy. He gave me 18 months. I want to be honest about my grief, because it matters for the story. Robert and I were married for 41 years. We had one daughter, Amelia, who is a pediatric neurologist at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. Amelia was 38 years old when her father died. She came home for the funeral. She stayed with me for 3 weeks. Then she went back to her hospital, and I was alone in a 4-bedroom colonial in Wexford Estates, and I was, for the first time in 41 years, not somebody's wife. I did not, in the first 4 months after Robert died, do very much. I fed the cat. I watered the plants. I went to the grocery store on Tuesdays. I did not attend the neighborhood garden club that I had been a member of for 19 years. I did not go to the Wexford Estates monthly women's coffee. I did not respond to the 2 casseroles Kimberly Ashcroft had in the early days, left on my front porch with polite notes. I did not go into the garage. I could not go into the garage, because the garage was where Robert's project sat. I need to describe the project, because it is the entire heart of this story. In 1998, Robert had acquired, through a very specific and legal process I will describe in a moment, a 1987 M998 high-mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicle, a Humvee, military green, canvas top. It was, at the time of acquisition, one of the earliest production Humvees ever built, and it had been used as an engineering test vehicle at a Naval Surface Warfare Center facility from 1988 until 1996, when it was formally declared surplus. The vehicle was surplus, but it was not, this is the critical part, not fully declassified. Robert acquired the vehicle in 1998 through a Department of Defense program called the Historical Vehicle Preservation Initiative. Under this program, senior DoD engineers with sufficient security clearance can, under specific conditions, take custody of surplus military test vehicles that have historical engineering significance. The vehicles are, technically and legally, still federal property. They are registered to the Department of Defense. They cannot be sold, transferred, or modified beyond a very specific list of preservation activities. The engineer who takes custody is, in effect, a caretaker, and the vehicle must be returned to DoD upon the engineer's retirement, death, or written request from the program. Robert had, in 2023, at his retirement, filed a formal extension request to continue as the vehicle's caretaker for the remainder of his life. The extension had been approved. When Robert died in May, that approval, I want you to remember this, did not automatically terminate. Under the program's rules, the vehicle passes to the deceased engineer's spouse for a transition period of up to 12 months, during which the spouse can either arrange return of the vehicle to DoD or file a preservation continuation request. I had not yet filed either. I did not, in fact, know what I was going to do about the vehicle. I did not know what I was going to do about anything, but I did know one thing about that Humvee, and I want to be very clear about this. That vehicle had a federal registration document, a DoD caretaker agreement, and, most importantly for what happened later, a small stainless steel plate mounted just inside the driver's side door frame. The plate read, "Property of the United States Government, Department of Defense, Naval Surface Warfare Center, removal, modification, tampering, or unauthorized access, prohibited by federal law, 18 U.S.C. Section 641. Robert had polished that plate every Sunday morning for 25 years. The Humvee sat in my driveway because our garage, at the time of Robert's death, contained partially disassembled engine components he had been servicing on the day he died. Amelia and I had, in the days after the funeral, made the decision to move the vehicle out of the garage, with the help of 2 of Robert's colleagues from Dahlgren, and park it in the driveway while we figured out what to do next. That was in May. By late September, the Humvee had been sitting in my driveway for 4.5 months. That is when Kimberly Ashcroft rang my doorbell. The HOA, I need to explain Kimberly Ashcroft to you, because she is the second most important person in this story. Kimberly is 58 years old. She is married to a retired oral surgeon named Douglas Ashcroft, who is 72 and who spends most of his time on a boat in Annapolis. Kimberly and Douglas moved to Wexford Estates in 2019. They live 3 houses down from me, in a colonial that is, per public record, almost identical to mine. Kimberly is the current vice president of the Wexford Estates Homeowners Association. She has been on the HOA board for 4 years. She is, per multiple neighbors I have since spoken with, the driving force behind approximately 80% of the HOA violation notices issued in the last 3 years. Kimberly and I had, in the first 3 years of her residency, exchanged approximately 11 pleasant conversations at HOA social events. She had, on more than one occasion, complimented me on my rose garden. She had, once, in 2021, mentioned that she thought Robert seemed very intense, a comment I had at the time understood to mean that she found my husband unfriendly, and that I had not corrected. Robert, for his part, had thought Kimberly was, and I am quoting my late husband, a small woman with a very loud voice about very small things. He had said this to me over dinner in the spring of 2022. It was the only thing he ever said about her. He was, in retrospect, more correct than he knew. I want to walk you through the sequence of events that led to Kimberly ringing my doorbell in late September, because the sequence is important. On the 9th of June, approximately 4 weeks after Robert died, Kimberly Ashcroft left the first of what would become 7 small notes in my mailbox. The first note said, "Margaret, so sorry for your loss. Just wanted to gently mention that the vehicle in your driveway might be violating our HOA's aesthetic standards. When you're feeling up to it, perhaps we can discuss. Kimberly, VP, Wexford Estates HOA." I did not respond to that note. On the 23rd of June, the second note appeared. "Margaret, following up on my last note, several neighbors have mentioned concerns about the vehicle. Would love to chat when you have a moment. K." I did not respond. On the 17th of July, note number 3. "Margaret, I understand this is a difficult time. However, the HOA has received 4 formal complaints about the vehicle in your driveway. Please let me know how you would like to proceed. Kimberly." I did not respond. The notes continued through August. Each one was slightly less warm than the one before it. The 7th and final note, dated the 9th of September, said, "Margaret, this is the final courtesy communication from the HOA. If the vehicle has not been removed by end of business on September 20th, the board will move to formal violation proceedings. K." I did not respond to that note either. I did not respond because, and I want to be honest, I was still in that specific kind of widow's grief where responding to a piece of paper about a vehicle in my driveway felt like it would require more energy than I had generated in 4 months. I understood, on some level, that I would eventually need to deal with the Humvee. I did not, at that moment, have the emotional capacity to think about it. What I did not understand, until Kimberly rang my doorbell, was that in the 4 months between June and September, Kimberly Ashcroft had been quietly building a case. Kimberly had, per what I later learned, photographed the vehicle from 6 different angles at 7 different times over the 4 months, compiled a spreadsheet of alleged aesthetic violations, rust patches, faded paint, uncovered canvas top, mud on the tires, solicited written complaint letters from 4 neighbors, none of whom, per my later conversations, had actually initiated the complaint themselves, but had signed a form Kimberly had brought them, presented a formal violation package to the HOA board at the September meeting on the 23rd, motioned for a vote to impose the maximum enforcement action available under the Wexford Estates HOA covenants, $300 per week in fines, escalating to potential lien against my property after 90 days. The motion had passed unanimously. Kimberly had, per multiple neighbors, argued at the meeting that the widow, that was the phrase she used, was using her grief as an excuse to lower property values in the neighborhood. She had, per one witness, added that, "We all sympathize, but at some point, personal responsibility has to matter." That was on a Monday night. She rang my doorbell on Tuesday morning at 8:47. I was in my bathrobe. My hair was uncombed. I had not, in the 4 months since Robert's death, been photographed by anyone. But I would learn, 3 weeks later, that Kimberly had taken a photograph of me on my doorstep in that bathrobe, and had, at the following HOA meeting, used it as evidence of the residence's overall decline. She handed me the yellow violation notice. She said her line about the 30 days and the $300 a week. I read the first line of the notice. Then I looked at her, this small woman with a very loud voice about very small things, standing on my front porch in a coordinated pink cashmere sweater set at 8:47 in the morning. And I said, "Kimberly, that vehicle is federal property." Kimberly Ashcroft blinked at me for approximately 2 seconds. Then she smiled the specific smile of a woman who believes she has heard everything. She said, "Margaret, honey, I know grief does funny things, but that is a rusted old Humvee. It is not federal property. Please, just call the tow yard and have it removed. Nobody needs a scene." I said, "Kimberly, it is federal property. The vehicle is registered to the Department of Defense. It was assigned to my husband under a preservation program in 1998. It is not, legally, mine to remove, or yours to fine, or the HOA's to touch." Kimberly's smile tightened slightly. She said, "Margaret, I am going to be very direct with you. That story sounds like something a grieving widow tells herself to avoid dealing with a problem. The board has voted. The fines start next week. I am telling you this out of kindness. Please handle the vehicle." I said, "Kimberly, would you like to come inside for a moment? I would like to show you something." She hesitated. She said, "Margaret, I really don't have—" I said, "Kimberly, please, come inside." She came inside. The documents, and the feds. I led Kimberly Ashcroft into Robert's study. The study was on the ground floor of the Colonial, at the back of the house, overlooking the small koi pond Robert had built in 2011. His desk was a heavy oak partner's desk we had bought at an estate sale in Alexandria in 2005. On the desk, in the exact position Robert had left them on the 12th of May, were 3 items: his reading glasses, a mug that said Naval Surface Warfare Center, 30 years, and a leather folder. I had not, since his death, moved any of them. I walked to the desk. I picked up the leather folder. I opened it. Inside the folder was a stack of documents. I removed the top 3. I laid them on the desk facing Kimberly. Document 1. A copy of a Department of Defense Historical Vehicle Preservation Initiative Caretaker Agreement, dated November 14, 1998. Assigning custodial responsibility for one 1987 M998 MWV, serial number redacted, to Robert James Whitfield, Senior Mechanical Engineer, Naval Surface Warfare Center, Dahlgren Division. Signed by the Program Director and countersigned by Robert. Document 2. A copy of the vehicle's federal registration, showing the vehicle as active federal property. Registration current through fiscal year 2027. Document 3, a copy of the caretaker extension approval from 2023, and, this is the critical page, a copy of the 12-month spousal transition provision from the program's rules, effective as of Robert's date of death. Kimberly stood over the desk. She looked at the documents. She did not, at first, read them carefully. She glanced at them. Then she picked up document 1. She actually read it. Her face went. In the specific stages I have seen in emergency rooms, I was a registered nurse for 29 years before I retired, through 5 distinct color changes. Pink to pale, pale to gray to a specific washed-out white back to pink, but a different pink than the pink she had walked in with. She said, This can't be real. I said, Kimberly, would you like to see the plate on the driver's side door frame? She said, The what? I said, The federal property plate. It's mounted on the door frame. It cites the federal statute that governs unauthorized tampering with the vehicle. Would you like to see it? It's on the driveway. Right there. Kimberly looked out the study window at the Humvee. She said, Margaret, I need to talk to Douglas. I said, Kimberly, before you go, I need to tell you something else. Because I want you to have complete information. She said, What? I said, Kimberly, under the terms of my husband's caretaker agreement, and under the federal statute cited on the vehicle's identification plate, any person or organization that takes formal enforcement action against the vehicle, for example by issuing fines, initiating removal proceedings, or otherwise interfering with its custody, is committing a federal offense. That is not a threat. That is a specification in the caretaker agreement. And I am, at this moment, required by the terms of my transition period to report any such interference to the Department of Defense Program Office within 72 hours of receipt of a formal notice. Kimberly stared at me. I said, Kimberly, you handed me a formal notice this morning at 8:47 a.m. It is now 9:11 a.m. I have until 8:47 a.m. on Friday morning to submit my report. I would very much like to give the HOA an opportunity to withdraw the violation before I file that report. Would you like to take the yellow notice back? Kimberly Ashcroft, standing in my late husband's study, with 63 years of my life around her and Robert's mug on the desk beside her, extended her hand. She said, Margaret, please give me back the notice. I handed her the notice. She took it. She folded it into her handbag. She said, Margaret, this was a misunderstanding. I am so sorry. I will personally speak with the board today. This will be handled. I said, Kimberly, thank you. Please have a good rest of your morning. She left. I stood in Robert's study for approximately 11 minutes after she was gone. I did not in those 11 minutes feel triumphant. I felt, more than anything, tired. I felt the specific tiredness of a widow who had, for 4 months, been left alone by the neighbors who had brought casseroles in the first 2 weeks, and who now, having been left alone, was being told that her grief was lowering property values. At 9:32 a.m., I sat down at Robert's desk. I picked up his phone, the one he had used, in his retirement, to keep in touch with his former colleagues at Dahlgren. I dialed a number I had watched Robert dial approximately once every 2 months for the past 2 years. The call was answered on the second ring by a man named Colonel James Whitcomb, United States Marine Corps, retired, who was now the civilian director of the Naval Surface Warfare Center's Historical Vehicle Preservation Initiative Program Office. He had been Robert's friend for 31 years. I said, Jim, it's Margaret. He said, Margaret, how are you holding up? I told him about Kimberly Ashcroft, about the 4 months of notes, about the HOA vote, about the yellow notice at 8:47 that morning, about Kimberly standing in Robert's study and taking the notice back at 9:11. Jim Whitcomb listened. He did not interrupt. When I was finished, he said, Margaret, I need to ask you a question. Do you want this handled quietly, or do you want the HOA to understand what almost happened here? I said, Jim, what are you suggesting? He said, Margaret, Kimberly Ashcroft withdrew the notice. That means, technically, the HOA has not filed formal enforcement action. Your 72-hour reporting requirement has not been triggered. You are free to let this go if you want to. I said, or? He said, or Margaret, I can send 2 people out to your house on Thursday morning, from the Federal Protective Service, to conduct what we call a standard custodial verification visit. It is a normal procedure. It occurs periodically for all Historical Vehicle Preservation Initiative vehicles. It does not, technically, require the involvement of any homeowners association. But if the two federal officers happen to arrive in a marked federal vehicle, and if they happen to spend 45 minutes at your house, and if they happen to knock on Kimberly Ashcroft's door on their way out to ask her a few procedural questions about her role in the recent HOA vote, well, that is a standard custodial verification visit. It is entirely within the program's normal operations. I said, "Jim, would you do that?" He said, "Margaret, I would do that in Robert's memory. He was the most decent engineer I ever worked with. He deserved better than to have his last 4 months be the 4 months when nobody in his own neighborhood remembered who he was." I said, "Jim, please send them Thursday." He said, "Thursday morning, 10 a.m., have coffee ready." I made coffee on Thursday morning at 9:30 a.m. The two Federal Protective Service officers, a woman named Special Agent Diana Ortiz, and a man named Special Agent Marcus Hall, arrived at 9:58. They were in a black GMC Yukon with federal license plates. They wore dark suits with small federal identification badges visible on their lapels. They spent 47 minutes at my house. They inspected the Humvee. They verified the federal identification plate. They took photographs of the vehicle's condition. They accepted a cup of coffee at Robert's kitchen table. They told me stories about Robert that I had never heard. At 10:45 a.m., they walked out my front door. They got into the black Yukon. They drove 3 houses down the street. They parked in front of the Ashcroft home. They spent 42 minutes at Kimberly Ashcroft's front door. I do not know, and have never asked, what was said during those 42 minutes. But I know what happened afterward. After Kimberly Ashcroft resigned from the Wexford Estates HOA board on the following Monday, her resignation letter, which was posted to the neighborhood community portal, cited personal reasons and a desire to focus on family matters. She has not, in the 8 months since, been present at a single HOA meeting. The formal violation against my Humvee was, per the emergency HOA meeting held on the Wednesday after the federal visit, unanimously withdrawn. The board issued a formal written apology, delivered to my mailbox by hand by the HOA president, a retired chemistry teacher named Walter Denning, who I had, before that morning, never actually met. Walter's apology said, in part, "Mrs. Whitfield, on behalf of the Wexford Estates Homeowners Association, I want to offer our sincere apology for the manner in which this matter was handled. Please know that the actions taken were not authorized by the majority of the board and did not reflect the values of this community. Your late husband's service to this country deserves our respect, not our interference. We are grateful for both of you. Walter Denning." I have kept the letter in the leather folder in Robert's study, next to the caretaker documents. The 4 neighbors who had signed Kimberly's complaint letters, all of whom, per my subsequent conversations, had signed under the impression that they were just supporting Kimberly with a small matter, each came to my door individually in the weeks after the incident. Each apologized. One of them, a woman named Susan Petrov who lives 2 houses down from me, brought me a lasagna and asked, gently, whether I would consider coming back to the neighborhood women's coffee. I went to the next coffee. I have been going ever since. Douglas Ashcroft, Kimberly's husband, sold their house in Wexford Estates in February. The Ashcrofts moved to Annapolis full-time, to be closer to his boat. The house was purchased by a young Marine Corps major and his wife, who have 3 children under the age of 10. The major introduced himself to me on his second day in the neighborhood. He noticed the Humvee. He asked me, respectfully, whether I would ever consider letting him bring his children over to see it up close. I said yes. He and his 3 children came over on a Saturday afternoon in March. His oldest, a 9-year-old boy named Henry, sat in the driver's seat of Robert's Humvee for approximately 11 minutes. He asked me 43 questions. I answered as many of them as I could. At the end of the visit, he said, "Mrs. Whitfield, did your husband build this?" I said, "Henry. My husband took care of this. He didn't build it, but he loved it very much." Henry said, "Can I take care of it when you don't want to anymore?" I said, "Henry, when the day comes that I don't want to anymore, I promise you I will think of you first." His father laughed. His mother teared up. I have not, in the 11 months since Robert died, filed the DoD return paperwork for the Humvee. I have filed a formal preservation continuation request in my name, under a widow's continuation provision I did not know existed until Jim Whitcomb walked me through it. The request was approved in December. The Humvee is, for the moment, mine to care for. Robert's tools are still in the garage. I have not moved them. Every Sunday morning, I go out to the driveway. I open the Humvee's driver's side door. I take a small tin of stainless steel polish and a soft cloth, and I polish the federal property identification plate. The plate reads, in the same words it has read for 25 years, Property of the United States Government, Department of Defense, Naval Surface Warfare Center, removal, modification, tampering, or unauthorized access, prohibited by federal law, 18 U.S.C. Section 641. Amelia flew home for a weekend in April. She sat with me in the driveway while I polished the plate. She said, Mom, Dad would love that you're doing this. I said, Amelia, I know, that's why I'm doing it. She said, are you going to keep the vehicle forever? I said, Amelia, I'm going to keep it as long as I want to, and when I don't want to anymore, I have a 9-year-old neighbor named Henry who is going to be the next caretaker. She said, Mom, that is a very good plan. I said, Amelia, it is a very good plan because I had a very good husband. If you have ever been the widow, or the sister, or the daughter of a man who worked quietly on something important, if you have ever been told by a stranger that the piece of your grief they could see from the street was making the neighborhood look bad, I want you to leave one word in the comments below. Just one word. The name of the thing your husband loved that you kept after he was gone. Say it. Because someone in this comment section is going to see your word, and they are going to remember to leave someone else's grief alone. And if this story reminded you that some things in a driveway are worth more than a neighborhood knows, subscribe. The pilot recognized me from the screen. I'll see you there.